Hi, if you're just joining us, I'm Matilda Gregg, the lead organiser of this workshop. This paper is part of a panel called Gender and Sexuality, which deals with the central question of what a military body or way of dressing or acting or cutting your hair is. If it's fair to say that we usually think of warriors as stereotypically masculine, how do warrior women or queer women or gender non-conforming women complicate our ideas about who fights and how and why? This video in particular will interest you if you're a fan of Steven Universe, the Mad Max movies, or the recent Netflix special, The Old Guard, or if you've ever wanted to know the theory behind why queer women are going to save the world.
Our next speaker is Héloise Thomas. Héloise is a PhD student at Bordeaux Montaigne University in France. Their dissertation, Archive, Empire, Apocalypse, studies representations of history in 21st century US literature through a queer, feminist, and decolonial lens. Their recent or forthcoming articles discuss women's autobiographical writings, lesbian representation, and poetics and politics of memory and the apocalypse in contemporary US culture. The title of their paper today is Joans and Pearl's Furiosas and Guerrillères, Queer Women, War, and the Apocalypse. Thank you.
First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this terrific conference, Matilda, the Wonder Women Workshop, and the Center for War Studies at UCD. It's just great being here. So for the sake of time, I will be cutting out a few examples from my talk, but I will be happy to make a copy of the extended presentation available afterward, if that's of interest to anybody. So I'm starting off with a simple observation, which is that lesbians don't usually fare particularly well in the apocalypse, courtesy of the bury your gays trope, which entered mainstream parlance with the untimely demise of Lexa and from a straight bullet in the post-apocalyptic show, The 100. But the past decade has also seen an uptick in the representation of queer-coded women wielding weapons and agency in post-apocalyptic narratives. Most of all, we're seeing women surviving war, even thriving in it and beyond it. So why are these three aspects taken together so significant? Queer women, war, and the apocalypse. The first reason, I have two. The first reason is because of the conventional association between masculinity and war. A warrior is usually a guy, and women warriors do exist. They have been recognized in history, but they're usually seen as these exceptions. They're even seen to a certain extent as supernatural, abnormal, monstrous, because they don't conform to gendered expectations. And this cognitive dissonance, a woman fighting, well, to deal with that cognitive dissonance, representations usually emphasize how much of a woman a warrior still is. She may wield swords, but she's still a girl. She still needs immense love. And think of Brienne of Stark right there. Anyway, so having unabashedly queer women in war spaces changes that, because these queer women refuse to be pinned down by the male gaze. They exceed it completely. They run counter to the characterizations of women in a heteronormative society. And I'm thinking here of Wittig's quote, "Lesbians are not women." So queer women in war don't even defy expectations because they function outside of traditional gendered expectations. The second aspect that I want to touch on is queer women in the apocalypse. So counter to the bury your gays trope that I evoked earlier, there is another trope that seems to be gaining popularity right now in recent shows, which is that lesbians will save the world. And I'm thinking about She-Ra here. So first of all, what is an apocalypse? So in its both religious and secular aspects, an apocalypse evokes a radical shift. It's a moment of crisis and conflict. It leads to a revelation of divine truth and salvation, or utter annihilation and loss of meaning, depending on whether it's a millennial or catastrophic apocalypse. An apocalypse also abolishes historical human time. It closes down futurity. There is no future after an apocalypse. And thus, queerness has often ruthlessly been interpreted as apocalyptic, as this death-bound and death-driven dynamic, because it does not produce, supposedly, a future that's considered as natural and sustainable and appropriate by a heteronormative system. This is obviously wrong. If anything, queerness redefines kinship, redefines futurity. it proves that the whole one dad, one mom, 2.5 kids, one golden retriever, and a picket fence model is the unnatural, unsustainable model. Because this nuclear family model is a recent capitalistic fabrication that deprives one of the larger community. And so much of queerness is built instead on choosing family, choosing kinship, building kinship in the face of tremendous odds. Queerness, thus, for me, is counter-apocalyptic because it reveals itself as life-affirming, as able to open up futurity, to move toward dynamics of utopia in ways that the apocalypse cannot. And so what does that entail for the representation of queer women in war? Well, in the narratives that I'm looking at, war is very often represented as potentially just, but a great ambivalence is always maintained. And this echoes the broader discussion about the use of violence against violent regimes. So the question is war morally sound, morally justified? Is it morally sound to wage war back against those who wage war against us? When does it stop being self-defense? When may it start being a toxic cycle of pure revenge without any horizon of healing or reconstruction beyond that? And this is where I feel that the insights that feminism and queer theory have brought to the table are really significant, because the portrayals of war and womanhood in those narratives are always fundamentally ambivalent. They show that there is no definitive answer to the question, is war just? Just like there is no definitive answer to the question, what is womanhood? Beyond a shared sense of patriarchal oppression. And this lack of definitive answers is profoundly queer, insofar as it prevents grand narratives from taking over once and for all. It reminds us that there is no one formula or paradigm that can solve once and for all every single moral problem known to humanity. And I'm going to give you a few examples that this will all seem less abstract. And in those examples, queer women are centerfold. They run counter to the fantasy of submissive, passive victims to be preyed on and exploited. They step up as catalysts of change, waging war against oppression in order to end the very possibility of war and oppression. And they suggest other ways of being in and relating to the world. I will start with Monique Wittig's foundational book, Les Guerrillères, where the title sets the tone. Les Guerrillères is a pun on guerrière, which is a female form of the noun warrior in French, and guerrilla type of attacks. The book was written in France in 1968, so a very fraught political climate, obviously, and it was translated into English and published in the US, I think, in 1973. So the transnational circulation of the book is happening during global feminist movements, very important. What's more, Wittig is a lesbian, and that set her apart even more within French feminist circles at the time, where a specifically lesbian type of feminism that was really centered on women's existence outside of any relationship to men was still considered too radical. Les Guerrillères was hailed as a feminist manifesto, as a parody of the hyper-masculine epic. The Guerrillères and their allies toppled the old patriarchal world order with guerrilla-type attacks. Their goal is the total destruction of patriarchal institutions, values, and languages. The Guerrillères, in this sense, are the harbingers of a counter-apocalypse that targets patriarchy, but does not seek to reproduce the old power structures that maintain hierarchy between the elect and the non-elect. The warriors in the Guerrillères have no interest in replicating old dynamics, either under another guise. And this is where I reference Hélène Wenzel's really great article on this, where Wenzel explains that at the beginning of the war against patriarchy in the book, female power is valorized over the male principle and symbolized not, I quote, by the womb which receives, reproduces, and nurtures the heterosexual ideology, but by the vulva, active, empowered, an autonomous locus of desire and energy, end of quote. Les Guerrillères quickly start questioning, I quote, still Wenzel, this reductive self-identification, and they end up rejecting these symbols along with language which has shackled women to an identity as a sexual being, end of quote. So the Guerrillères' counter-apocalypse brings the revelation that a revelation that's truly emancipating, which is that in order to achieve the end of oppression, you have to break away and to break open the old oppressive category of womanhood without replacing it with another oppressive, essentializing category. And at this point in the book, Wittig writes a lovely quote, which I want to really quote in its entirety, which is, "They say that at the point they have reached, they must examine the principle that has guided them. They say it is not for them to exhaust their strength in symbols. They say, henceforward, what they are is not subject to compromise. They say they must now stop exalting the vulva. They say they must break the last bond that binds them to a dead culture. They say that any symbol that exalts the fragmented body is transient and must disappear. Thus it was formerly. They, the women, the integrity of the body, their first principle, advance marching together into another world." And so this renewed relationship to the body, freed of old oppressive symbolisms, animates Wittig's writings on the lesbian body in her subsequent works. And so I'm going back to this phrase of Wittig, lesbians are not women. Why? Because lesbian identities and existences are assembled and lived outside of the heteropatriarchal system that defines womanhood. And this phrase, I believe, is the key to understanding the workings of women's liberation in this book. In French, the guerrillères are referred to with the pronoun elle, which is a female form of they in French, which is a nuance lost in the English translation, obviously. Elle here do not designate an immutable essence of womanhood. Rather, this pronoun points to women as a social and historical class. The guerrillères thus start off as women, or most of them do anyway. But through the war waged against patriarchy, out of which they emerge victorious, the guerrillères unbecome women. And since they choose anti-patriarchal kinships that center women and anyone oppressed by patriarchy, they also become eminently lesbian and queer. So by becoming warriors and enacting an apocalypse unto patriarchy, the guerrillères reclaim agency, free themselves from normative womanhood, and quite inevitably end up turning to lesbian feminism to create a new world brimming with different possibilities, different womanhoods, different ways of being. So I will give two examples from TV. The first one is the character Furiosa from the Mad Max Fury Road movie. And I chose it because it's one of the most recognizable symbols in recent pop culture of female agency that does not replicate the whole strong female character trope. Furiosa is a war captain for the tyrannical Immortal Joe in a bleak, devastated post-apocalyptic world. But she is no good little soldier. She leads Joe's concubines, also called the Five Wives or breeders, which gives you a hint about their position in this world. She leads them to freedom. At first, she decides to head to the utopic green place where she was born, where Furiosa was born, in the clan of the Vuvalini, before being kidnapped. When she realizes that the green place has become completely uninhabitable, she heads back to Joe's citadel where water and greenery abound. And her purpose here is to end Immortal Joe's tyranny, to break the cycle of post-apocalyptic oppression, and hopefully restart a sense of futurity cut short by Joe's unrelenting reign. And Theron, the actress who plays Furiosa, seems to really like these warrior woman roles because very recently in the movie The Old Guard, she plays Andy. Andy is short for Andromachocythia. Andromache can be translated as one who fights men, which could be a reference to the Amazons, especially since I believe that Andy at some point wields Labrys, which is a long-time lesbian symbol. So Andy is an immortal warrior. She was possibly in a romantic relationship with her fellow immortal woman warrior companion Quinn. She is a post-apocalyptic warrior in a world that never understands itself as a post-apocalyptic. And she endlessly plays her part as a warrior in apocalyptic conflicts, about which she remains ambivalent, all the while fighting for more justice. In both cases, with Furiosa and Andy, even though their actual sexuality is never really clearly labeled, they are very much queer-coded. And I'm not even talking about the whole androgynous butch appearance, right? It's that their worldview and their actions are shaped by their relationships to women. Their identity as post-apocalyptic warriors fighting for justice cannot be separated from a specifically lesbian, queer type of feminism. Here, I'm defining lesbian according to Adrienne Rich's definition of a lesbian continuum in Compulsory Heterosexuality. I quote, for me, it's a range of woman-identified experience which can embrace many more forms of primary intensity between and among women, including the sharing of a rich inner life, the bonding against male tyranny, the giving and receiving of practical and political support, and so on. So that's how I really see them. And then my second example from TV may seem a little out of place here because we're talking about an animated show primarily for children. It's Steven Universe. So in Steven Universe, the titular character is a young boy. His dad is human. His mom is a crystal gem. Crystal gems are alien defenders of the planet Earth. They are gem-based life forms. Steven is raised, his mother dies when giving birth to him, and so he is raised by 3 other crystal gems who are kind of his surrogate aunts, and we're close, very close to his mom. So crystal gems, so they're technically sexless, a bit like Janet on The Good Place, right? Not a girl, not a robot. And they're technically non-binary, but they all use she, her pronouns, and their gender presentations also vary, even though they tend to be more feminine than masculine overall. So crystal gems are not women, but their representation here functions as a queer commentary on the diversity of womanhood. And it's an echo also, I believe, to the showrunner Rebecca Sugar's comments about identifying as a non-binary woman. So Steven's mom is Rose Quartz. She was a high femme warrior and a leader of the resistance against another group of imperialistic gems. Her right-hand gem is Pearl. Pearl's original purpose, she was created to unquestioningly serve Rose Quartz. And instead, she became one of Rose's most protective and fiercest warriors. She is devoted to the memory of Rose and to the task of raising, protecting, and loving Rose's son. And it's very clear that Pearl was in love with Rose, but the feelings were not reciprocated. So it's hard to imagine that the very pretty pink world of Steven Universe could be post-apocalyptic, but I believe it is, because it was basically created by a war waged millennia ago between 2 gem factions. A war that created an apocalypse, as in a moment of crisis with life-altering consequences, and this war threatens to spill over into the timeless present of Beach City, where Steven and his chosen family live. Throughout all this, Pearl remains a warrior, which becomes starkly visible when she teaches sword fighting, her specialty, to Connie, who is Steven's friend who wants to protect him, in the same way that Pearl wants to protect Rose. In the following musical number, Pearl says, I quote, "Everything you have, everything you are, you've got to give on the battlefield. When everything is chaos and you have nothing but the way you feel, your strategy and a sword, you just think about the life you'll have together after the war." So Pearl has gone through many wars, but what animates her is imagining what lies beyond. This gives her the hope that the future will not be foreclosed by war, and this gives her also the courage to see war through and to protect the one she loves. So this sense of futurity is kept open by queer kinships established among the characters. Pearl does not end up with Rose, who falls in love with a mortal man, but Pearl is there to love and to protect Rose's child and help him grow. She even gets a crush on a human girl, and she is there to be a part of a new post-apocalyptic diverse community that is not based on oppression, but on solidarity and togetherness, and on love. So, in conclusion, when queer women fight in apocalyptic wars, they're never mere soldiers acting under orders which they follow unquestioningly. Instead, they're warriors insofar as they possess agency, which serve their allegiance to a greater purpose. The latter is more often than not utopia-driven, even when it appears under the guise of revenge. Women warriors want to topple old orders that have benefited the few to the detriment of the many. They want to restore equality, they want to restore justice, They want to restore a world that can function otherwise. And I will end with a quote by Wittig from Les Guerrillères, always, which is, they say, let those who call for a new language first learn violence. They say, let those who want to change the world first seize all the rifles. Thank you.
Thanks so much for watching this talk, which was part of the Gender and Sexuality panel. If you haven't already, go check out the other 2 talks in this panel by clicking the links on screen now.